RDG Planning and Design is a nationally recognized multidisciplinary firm offering professional services in architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, lighting design, strategic planning, urban and comprehensive planning and design, graphic design, engineering, and integrated and public art. Diverse in knowledge and experience, they are united in their pursuit to create meaning together with their clients and in their communities, and by their drive to live responsibly and do it well. Decades of dedication to success had taken them around the world, and today their commitment to communication and technology allows them to engage clients anywhere from their offices in Colorado, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms. I'm Stephanie Rouse.
I'm Jennifer Hyatt.
And we're the hosts of the Book on Planning podcast. In today's episode, we talk with author Donald Elliott on his book, An Even Better Way to Zone, Achieving More Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Communities. And this one is one in a string of zoning books that have come out recently. We've covered several others in the last couple of years that some of them are in line with Don's thinking on zoning of we need to reform it, but keep it. And then we also get in a little bit onto M. Nolan Gray's book, Arbitrary Lines, which is the opposite approach of how we should get rid of zoning.
Yeah, and just in keeping with mentioning the other books that we have covered, Sarah Bronin's Key to the City was there too. I think we cover the whole gamut of zoning and zoning reform with just those three books, really. But this was very interesting. Don had written a book a couple decades.
About 20 years ago.
About 20 years ago, yeah. On the basic principles of zoning. So it's really interesting to hear him come back 20 years later with all of the insight that he's developed since he wrote that first book.
Yeah, and he talks about how in the first book, he was laying out some of the elementary principles, the basics of zoning, and how his last 2 decades of working in the field, he understands different concepts better. And in the book, he says how if you want the basics, go back to that original book, but he's not repeating any of that. It's really picking up from where he is now and moving forward and really very much focusing on redevelopment. And he says that a couple times in the episode about how it's not about zoning blanketing the city. He's really targeting infill and redevelopment sites and overhauls in the zoning code that we need for supporting that.
Made my little economic developer heart happy to finally have a book that really did focus on infill development. We don't have a lot of those in the genre. So let's get into our conversation with author Donald Elliott on his book, An Even Better Way to Zone, Achieving More Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Communities.
Don, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, An Even Better Way to Zone, Achieving More Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Communities. Almost 20 years ago, you released A Better Way to Zone, 10 Principles to Create More Livable Cities. Now you're back with An Even Better Way to Zone, which sort of picks up where you left off. Can you give an overview of how the books differ and what prompted you to write the follow-up?
Well, they are very different books. Hopefully, since it's been almost 20 years, I am 20 years older and wiser. Certainly, I have done a lot more zoning projects since 2018 and seen more things, and I do address more situations. In general, A Better Way to Zone, the first book, was more general. It was based on my understanding of what I saw as mistakes in zoning and mistakes in understanding zoning that were broadly applicable regardless of what kind of a code you had or what kind of community you were. The new book, An Even Better Way to Zone, is more focused. There's a section on mistakes we make in thinking about zoning, but really it focuses on 4 substantive topics, which I think are very current, or at least almost all of our projects ask for improvements in these areas. And those 4 areas are more affordable housing, more sustainable development, fairer zoning outcomes for the disadvantaged, and then an overarching focus on the need to zone for continued reuse and redevelopment rather than just thinking about what you want today. Zoning's a governance system, and I'm more aware of that than I was 18 years ago. And I'm more aware of how people, I think, don't understand that. And seeing it as a governance system rather than a wish list for what you wish you could get today would lead to better communities.
Well, I have to admit, I have a better way to zone sitting on this bookshelf behind me. And when I was first starting out as a planner, my first job was a zoning administrator out in a rural county in Nebraska. So it came in very helpful for me. So thank you so much for putting it out back then as well. Speaking of, how have our past practices, like planning for development as it could be, not as land actually is, or as you say in the book, a pure form of planning, created some of these zoning flaws that we were talking about?
Well, I think one of the major problems is that we tend not to think about reuse and redevelopment of land. We tend to apply planning thinking to zoning problems. Now, the two are linked. There's a whole podcast we could do on the differences between planning and zoning. But planning really draws on visioning of what the community really wants to have happen. And we encourage people to be broad and to not be constrained by what they've seen today, but to bring new ideas to the table and to envision a very different and better place. Zoning is a different thing. Zoning is your legal right to do or not do things with your property. Many zoning ordinances treat reuse and redevelopment land, infill parcels, things that have already been built one and need to be redeveloped, as if they can be regulated by raw land. When you are expanding the city or dealing with raw land, there are no utilities in the ground. There's a limited number of constraints. You can think broadly and imagine and negotiate for what you want. On an infill property and a redevelopment property, you're much more constrained. And so I think that's one of the things we failed to do right, is to lead the public into a real understanding about zoning for infill and redevelopment parcels and the fact that it has to be more flexible. And a lot of things you could dream about if the property had never been developed before and didn't have neighbors don't apply. They're just not a reasonable thing for the government to do or to want to do.
So that's one of the major flaws in a lot of our zoning ordinances is treating infill and new development parcels the same. Are there any other more egregious flaws that you see over and over again in community zoning codes that they really need to address in the near term?
Yes, most codes these days have gone down the road of having too many discretionary approvals based on vague standards. That's the second thing that happens, is that then we tend to think of zoning as, gee, what do I want to happen here? We tend to not do the hard work of saying, well, this or this range of things would be consistent with our plan, and these would not be. We instead say, well, why don't we have a conditional hearing on it? We're going to come forward and have a public hearing and saying, is what this guy is proposing, you guys like that or not? That's a very expensive and time-consuming way to do zoning. It puts the builder, even a builder who thinks they have followed all the rules and is proposing something that is consistent with the plans and consistent with zoning, to go through kind of a popularity contest, a beauty contest on this. So that is another thing that adds a lot of time, expense, and uncertainty. And frankly, that kills innovative projects. On the one hand, conditional approvals serve a purpose. You look at it more carefully and you see what you really think. Now, who can argue against that? But they also do a lot of harm because they kind of say you can never count on what's going to happen. And we pay a high price for that in terms of getting zoning to take the community where it wants to go.
Yeah, we have a lot of our bigger developments beyond just a small little site infill that are using our PUD in order to do development. So every single big project has to go through planning commission, sometimes city council, and it's always a bigger, longer, drawn out process in order to get a project through here in the city of Lincoln. I'm sure it's like that across the nation.
It is. And I have never had a client, and I have worked in 80 different communities writing codes, who said, I'd like to use my PUD process more. Every one of them says, we'd like to use it less because it's unpredictable, it's time consuming. Not only does the original PUD have to be negotiated and then recommended and then approved, often in the interest of getting it approved, people make promises that they can't keep. So 5 years down the road, you got to go back and do it again to amend it. And a couple of years after that, you need to go back and amend. I know PUDs that have been amended over 10 times, each one of which is a negotiated trip back through city council. It's a terrible way to run a government or to get where you want to go. In a better way to zone, I said, I think PUDs are only really useful in two contexts. One is a master planned big development, probably on the edge of the city, because that's not cookie cutter. You can do a lot of innovative things I can do this over here, but I can't do it over there. I could mix the housing like this if you really wanted me to. There's a lot of flexibility to negotiate for good things because the parts are all moving and there are very few constraints. The other one they use is really complicated infill projects. But most infill projects are not complicated. They're just overregulated. If you loosened up and said it's important to have a system that will put this land into productive use again in a way that is helpful to the community and okay with the neighbors, that is a value in itself. And if we took away some of the boxes that you have to check and some of the popularity contests, we could do that. So it doesn't deserve a PUD for a small infill property. It just deserves unregulating some of it.
We have I work in redevelopment. We have 2 redevelopment projects in Lincoln. One, it was a full industrial tract that we cleared out and have done redevelopment. We put a PUD on that. We refer to that PUD all the time. It's really helpful. And then we have a small housing project that wanted to put in townhouses, but it couldn't on the 0.8 acre lot that they had under the zoning code. So they put a PUD on it to change the zoning there. And it's a pretty great housing project. We should have just been able to move through it, but it added 4 months to the process.
We could do an entire podcast of my nightmare stories of the misuse of PUD powers because caused by zoning ordinances that didn't allow reasonable things to happen.
So you say in the book that zoning was designed to exclude. That was its original purpose. It's very effective at doing so. So how do we utilize a tool designed to exclude to start creating that more inclusive development?
That is the $1 million question. That is the hard question, and we've been struggling with it for a long time. I think my elevator speech, my value proposition on this is exclude less and do it more thoughtfully and with a clear understanding of who benefits and who gets hurt by this exclusion. We have overused the power to exclude, and to be honest, we have made it kind of a popularity contest, and people with more money and more time and more understanding of local government and more English skills have a much better ability to exclude things they don't like from the areas around them. And one of the problems is when you exclude something from your neighborhood, the market doesn't just walk away. It tries to figure out where it can meet that market need. And so there is a fair chance that it will land in another neighborhood nearby, as close to the market demand as the guy can or the woman can acquire property, that is not as able to defend itself against that. And that is, unfortunately, zoning is really good at driving away projects, but it doesn't kill them. The market still wants to do it. I do think some people imagine, well, then it'll go to my neighboring city, which is, first of all, selfish and kind of silly. That's not the game. The game is to try to create a community writ large, not just your city, where people can afford to live and thrive and have opportunities. So, oh, maybe it'll go to my neighbor, and then it's their problem, is actually not an adult response to this question. But it could go to a poorer neighborhood or a less organized neighborhood in your own community. And that's not how zoning's supposed to operate. It's not supposed to empower those with more to be able to keep what they have. Now, I admit, often in zoning's history, that's been exactly what we thought it was supposed to be there. But I don't think it was supposed to be that way. And I think in light of, zoning was done in 1916. The Civil Rights Act was approved in 1964. We've grown up since then enough to realize that some of the original motivations behind this tool don't have to be the way we use it and shouldn't be the way we use it.
Yeah, one of the more well-known examples of exclude less lately is the getting rid of single-family zoning. And it's really highlighting how hard it can be to zone less because so many communities have built out these incredibly long, complicated zoning ordinances that are trying to put so many restrictions and exclude everything. And they're really catering towards the more vocal, connected populations and neighborhoods that have the ability to advocate and say, I want all these protections. I need to make sure I protect my property values. Therefore, we have to do all these other things. And so it can be politically very challenging, I think, for some of these communities to try and exclude less.
Oh, it is very hard. And particularly in that context of allowing duplexes, triplexes, or anything other than single family housing in a single family zone district. And you know what? It's amazingly hard. And that's because people are worried about change and they're defensive. And to some degree, they're focused on what they think are the things that will increase their property values. I pointed out to a city in the last 10 years that even in the neighborhood that was most up in arms, highly educated neighborhood, up in arms against any change to single family zoning, that their neighborhood had 264 examples of duplexes, ADUs, and apartment buildings mixed in with them. And they loved that neighborhood. And if you love that neighborhood, then what about these things is inherently bad for your neighborhood? There is a fear of change. There's a lot of fear mongering that goes out there. There are two things that I think are optimistic. One is increasingly, and we're seeing this in Colorado where I live, when city councils have the courage to say, we need to do this. You just can't keep 75% of your land out of play. That's what it is. It's 70 to 80% of land is single family zoning in many cities. So somehow we're going to solve the affordable housing problem while keeping 75% of the land out of the picture. We're going to tie one hand behind our back and one foot up. And then we're going to see if we can figure out how to dance and how to do this. And the answer is it's a silly way to do governance. In those places that have had the courage to do reasonable things, often we're finding political movements, the Yes in My Backyard movement, others who will motivate people. We are in the middle of a vote right now, a referendum in the city of Lakewood, Colorado, over whether the community is going to reverse or uphold their more flexible zoning system. I don't want to predict how it's going to come out, but 10 years ago, there would have been no one out there campaigning for the changes. There's a very powerful lobby out there campaigning for the changes right now. And I don't think the people who are scared of these things, I think they kind of expect that everybody will say, yeah, let's not do this. And the answer is no, they're going to be people who see the bigger picture and are willing to organize and raise some money to push for this because it's in your city's good, even though you don't like it, and the community's good writ large. That's one of the things that is happening that makes me optimistic about the potential for change.
Every time we have someone who shows up in opposition, even to the duplex or the ADU portion of the changes that we're trying to make in Lincoln, I point out to them that our country club neighborhood and a neighborhood in our city called the Sheridan neighborhood along Sheridan Boulevard, they have duplexes, they have quads, and then they have the kind of housing where it's turned inward and it's small houses, like cottage housing. All of that housing exists in your favorite neighborhood in Lincoln. Do you think it ruined the neighborhood? Nobody thinks that those houses are in our existing neighborhoods. It's just, I'm like, go take a walk.
I think the other thing that is lost in this discussion, and it's a hard argument to make, but the truth is these changes to single family neighborhoods are going to happen slowly because I have to wake up and say, I want to build an ADU. Most of my neighbors would not wake up and say they want to build an ADU, or they have to sell their house to somebody who says, honey, we could buy this house and build an ADU. That happens slowly. And the fear mongering kind of acts like, well, that's the game right there, isn't it? The whole neighborhood's going to go. And the answer is no. Everything happens slowly in the path. It'll happen because it's individual property owners. And even if it is, God forbid, a bank or an institution, that happens relatively slowly, only as people decide they want their property to change or they want to sell. So it's a hard argument to make because on the one hand, it should calm people down and say, look, the city's changed. We see it happen all the time. And yes, it's unreasonable really for me to think that this neighborhood won't and shouldn't change. That's fine. But the argument that it's going to happen slowly, unfortunately, feeds the opposition. Then why are we doing it? Yeah, why? If it's going to happen slowly, then it won't solve the housing prices. Why don't you go pick on somebody else? And so it's a hard argument to make, but the truth is it ought to be out there because it is the truth. This neighborhood will likely 5 years from now be very much like it is today. It will be on the trajectory to help solve the housing crisis, and a lot of land will be in that category, but the impacts on any given block are likely to be minimal.
Yeah, we're about to amend our ADU ordinance here in the city of Lincoln, and it had been so restrictive that you basically had to have the lot size of a duplex to be able to put an ADU on it. So almost no one could do it. I can't remember the exact percent, but it's like 70 or 80% of the lots in Lincoln will actually be able to do an ADU after this. And there's all the typical pushback of now there's going to be ADUs everywhere. But as you said, like you have to want to do the ADU, and a lot of people don't want that. And there's an ownership requirement to it. So one of the units has to still be owner occupied. Not everyone wants to be a landlord, and they don't want to have someone living on their lot with them.
Interestingly, that's been the trajectory in most of the codes I have experience with. When you first adopt it, it has a lot of belts and whistles and ifs and ands or buts or conditions, which almost guarantee it's going to happen really slowly. And then within a few years, people come in and amend it because it turns out this is not a problem. Not only has it happened slowly, so people are not upset about it, but the ones that are happening, people have more experience with them, and the fear is kind of gone. We already did this. Now we're just removing restrictions from it. And you know what? They're fine. Nobody's bothered the second time around. That's happened in a variety of innovative zoning areas where it's going, let's do it with a lot of safeguards. And then like, all right, safeguards turn out to be unnecessary.
So you talked earlier about one of the flaws being that we are zoning as if we're planning. And one way we do that is trying to zone to a picture, as you say in the book. And I was just in a meeting like a week or so ago as I was preparing for this interview where we were talking about a redevelopment site. And the next steps are to collect imagery of what we want the site to look like. So why is it bad to zone to a picture?
Well, I like the use of pictures in development codes. At the beginning of my career, 30 years ago, we didn't do them very much. Now we do them because they do help to explain scale. How tall would the building be with respect to other buildings around it? How much of the lot would it occupy? Is it going to be required to be at the front or back of the lot? Is parking going to be behind the building, in front of the building? So diagrams are usually helpful, although they usually have a little footnote saying the picture is not regulatory. You can't come in and say, doesn't look like that. So they're very helpful as a tool to communicate zoning visually. And I like that. We use them more and more and more. The problem is often it is understood by the public, especially in a redevelopment and infill process, as this is what's going to happen. I had a developer tell me years ago, and I think I included this in the book. He said, Don, development in general is net fishing. You do something the market wants to do and you catch a percentage of the market. Redevelopment is spear fishing. You have to find an idea for the reuse of this property that someone else has not found, that works around the utilities and it works around the terrain change or the soil issues or the inadequate frontage, whatever it is, or the fact that it has an unpopular neighbor. They have a neighbor that means no one's ever going to use this for the most popular use because look what's next to it. And that predates zoning and it's still there. Lots of constraints on redevelopment. And my real objection to zoning to a picture is that it leads the public to think that's what's going to happen. And especially in redevelopment, reuse, and infill, it's fairly likely you cannot draw a picture today of what will happen because it's going to turn on a creative developer finding something the market will support that someone else has not thought of before that. If it could be done the way everybody wants it to be done, it would have been done already. There is something about that lot that makes it hard. And hard means you need to find some flexibility to do it. And I'll just make this point again. Study after study after study out there has said, why does Don talk so much about redevelopment and infill? Because it is the most sustainable way to develop, and it is the most equitable way to develop. That doesn't mean our cities won't have to expand, but right now the finger is on the scale, making it easier to go out and expand into raw land, and it shouldn't be. It's kind of like the argument that seatbelts don't save lives. It has been disproved. There is not a good study out there that says infill is not more sustainable and more equitable and could be more affordable in the long run because the housing and the transit collectively are cheaper than a cheaper house in the suburbs where you have to drive further. All of those studies say that we need to be doing this. The problem is we make it harder than raw land development. And one of the ways that we compound it, I think, is by leading the picture to say, we will only let this be used if it looks like this. So pictures are better at routine new development, not an infill parcel, something that is unconstrained than they are in the context of redevelopment and reuse.
So we've talked about a few of these already, but you put forth the term in the book, a negative trifecta. So what is this negative trifecta and how can cities avoid such what you call a lose-lose-lose situation?
Well, most people, when they think about zoning, first they think about citizens and to some degree elected officials and appointed officials. They think about the map. And after that, they think about the rules because the map just tells you where the different sets of rules apply. So they think of those two things. And I call zoning procedures, the rezoning process, the process of getting a conditional use approval, a site plan approval, a subdivision approval. Subdivision is really a different area of law. But, how do I get to yes? How do I get from a good idea that I think you should like to a permit to go forward and build this? And procedures I call the unsexy corner of zoning because nobody wants to talk about how the cogs turn, how the wheels turn, or they get gummed up, or how many boxes you have to check to do it. But that is as important, especially to affordability and sustainability. And I would say equity, it's important to all three because the negative trifecta means when you add time to an approval or money to get through the approval or uncertainty as to whether you will get the approval or on what conditions, you drive away good ideas. So you get the innovative guy or woman who thinks they've got a more sustainable, energy efficient or water efficient project to bring forward that you haven't seen before. If they have to go through a month-long, 6-month-long, 9-month-long process to get to yes, whole lot of them are going to walk away. It's not worth it because most of all the uncertainty, it's a new idea. I don't even know if you're going to say yes to the idea. So all of these things drive away the innovation we need to get beyond the way we've done things in the past, but they also hurt small businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, businesses owned by those with physical or mental handicaps. All of these things have less financing, less ability to stand the course and to have a month's delay. And again, this is one of these things where it's facially neutral language, but we know who gets hurt the most by time, expense, and uncertainty. It's not the big people. They just roll it into their national portfolio and you get a monthly call and say, sorry, they put us over for another 2 months. We'll have to carry the land with no revenue. Sorry, I haven't hit my quota for the month, but the corporation can uphold it. Small business can't do that. I've only got one project, and if I can't be sure it's going to go through, or I've only got 2 projects, and I can't cover the extra costs of a delay and uncertainty on this project by my one other project, and so I won't be doing business with you. And it's just not good governance. Planning is visioning. Zoning is telling people what is acceptable to get the community where it wants to go. Negotiate it and decide it ahead of time and put it in your code so that people can invest knowing that they will get what they bargained for. That if I do X, you will give me an approval for Y. And that opens the door to a lot more businesses, a lot more minorities and other people to participate in it. But it also means you're going to get more innovative ideas. I do this with incentives. I tell them, just write your code. You give me X, I will give you Y. We know that it may not be a popularity contest, but that is the deal that will bring our community where we need to be going.
Well, and an alternate approach to solving that problem is to just get rid of zoning altogether. And we've had Nolan Gray on the podcast to talk about that approach. What are the main problems with this related to land use regulation?
So it's a great question. I like Nolan's book, Arbitrary Lines. I recommend people read it. I think he makes a compelling case, a stronger case even than I do about the problems of zoning. It has lots of problems. In the book, I identify 4 things that I think are fundamental issues. Restrictive covenants are private law. They form a club among people who agree on what this area wants to be. It's not public law. Zoning and subdivision and affordable housing incentives are public law. And they are made in a public context where you have to debate things and you have to comply with some federal and state requirements. Group homes being an example. You can't just say no to group homes. The Fair Housing Act says you can't do it. And so cities are forced into, well, where are we going to say yes? And how are we going to say yes? Many restrictive covenants say no group homes. They never went through a public review. That's unenforceable, but they were written privately and they say things and they are intended to do things like keep out poorer people and smaller houses that wouldn't survive public scrutiny if they were debated in public as a public policy. They're private contracts that create private clubs. So one problem is simply they're designed to be even more exclusive. Zoning was designed to exclude, so were covenants. And as they're currently used, they're usually saying, oh, all the things that zoning won't let you do, we're going to give you another list beyond that. You can't not have irrigation on your land, on your property. You can't have an outdoor clothesline. You can't paint your house purple. One of the problems you raised earlier is, how do you take a tool that's designed to exclude and not make it exclude? Well, here's another tool that's designed to exclude, and it's done without public scrutiny, basically. So you'd have to create a system somehow where there was, I think, some level of public scrutiny so that people weren't free to just write whatever discriminatory or exclusionary rules they wanted to. That's kind of 2 of the things. They're more exclusive and they're done out of the public spotlight. I also have a hard time envisioning how you would get them to cover an entire community. Right now, covenants are only, to be honest, newer and wealthier communities because they were put on before the land was developed. Zoning had to fit retroactively on stuff that was already developed, plus deal with new stuff. I mean, the government would have to say, thou shalt have a system of private club rules in your area, but they'd have to say that for all neighborhoods. Again, in my mind, I've never seen a city in which restrictive covenants cover all neighborhoods. I'm not even sure that's true of Houston. The final reason is restrictive covenants are usually enforced through the courts, meaning you have to take somebody to court and enforce. That's expensive, it's time consuming, and it requires you to sue your neighbors or sue people in your club, and that's hard to do. And if you don't do it over time, the courts will deem that you have been inconsistent in your enforcement of your rules, and we're not going to enforce things that you don't even care to enforce consistently. We're not going to let you pick your victims as they violate your laws. So yes, I suppose if you put a gun to my head and said, invent a system of restrictive covenants that would somehow cover the whole city through public review that would have some sort of administrative, non-judicial enforcement process, and that wouldn't be as exclusive or have as many bad impacts as current zoning. If you told me I had to do it, I guess I would write it, but I had never seen it. And I think those are the 4 reasons why we won't see it, actually.
Yeah. In our conversation with Nolan, I asked him about, how do you enforce? Who enforces? What are your plans here? And he did make a comment that potentially we should have some easier way to enforce. I'm like, so you're just creating zoning, but calling it something different? That doesn't make any sense either.
That's the thing. The cities would probably have to get involved in enforcement. And these days, cities don't want to be involved in enforcing private club rules. Again, I don't want to be narrow. If you told me to invent one, I suppose I could write an article and do it, but it would have a whole lot of wishing about things in the future that I just don't see happening.
Exactly. So I walk through my downtown of my community pretty regularly since I am a redevelopment planner and I'm helping to redevelop downtown. And I see so many empty first floor commercial spaces. It's heartbreaking, honestly. And you make the argument that poor zoning has contributed to this market mismatch. So how did that happen and what can planners do to reduce that mismatch?
Well, I think zoning has absolutely contributed to it. There's a sexy idea out there called you should have multifamily with ground floor retail next to transit, all of which are true statements. They're wonderful. We love the image. Do you want to get the public on your side? Show them a picture of transit running by people drinking lattes outside of an attractive multifamily building, eating at the cafe. So it's a great idea. The problem is the market can't support nearly as much as we have required to do. We have applied it broadly, way too broadly. And the example I'd give you is that years and years ago, before this was a big trend, Denver, when I worked for the city and county of Denver, considered, should we require ground floor retail uses in all of downtown? Well, downtown's about 200 acres, had at that point 25 or 30 million square feet of office uses that were healthy, restaurants, everything else. And we said, what's the market for ground floor uses among all the people who live and work downtown? And if you know Denver, you know that the downtown is basically between 14th and 18th Street. It's about a mile long. And 16th Street is the pedestrian mall that runs down the middle. And the answer to the market study was you could force it on the 16th Street Mall and a half a block in either direction on the side streets. There's enough market demand for that, not the second half of the first block out, and definitely not the second block out. So even in Denver, where they did a study and they were careful about it. So there are 2 or 3 things. A, don't require it everywhere. When we think about that image of cafe under a multifamily, it's cool. But if you go to the places we like, and I'm going to name some, and some people say, they don't like it. But if you go to Vienna or Paris or New York or Chicago or places where you like the urbanism, there's lots of buildings that have just apartments. They don't have ground floor retail. It's a mix. And the answer is, they didn't force it to happen and then it stays vacant because they allowed the fact that, yes, there are probably some frontages. Denver now requires it on certain frontages that you really want to be pedestrian active. But those are very limited. And more commonly, we have just said, do it everywhere in this zone district or everywhere in way too big an area. And so we have forced people to do it. There are some halfway solutions. The big one is be thoughtful. I use a quote in my book, I think, or in my class. There's nothing more dangerous than a good idea if it's the only one you have. Don't just do this because it's the cool thing to do. Apply it selectively. And what's happened over time, again, as a second order ordinance, is that people have lightened up and said, you don't actually have ground floor retail. Here are the things you can't do on the ground floor. Can't do a parking garage. Can't do a stairwell. Can't do a utility room. You figure it out. And that's why we have so many exercise rooms. They're not being used for exercise, but that's what was left to do. But my point was, if you're worried about blank walls, you can prevent that. You can't make the market occupy space if there's no market to happen. So why would you try?
Your book outlines a number of areas where zoning codes need to be updated to better support affordable, equitable, and sustainable outcomes. And you just gave an example in this last answer about how getting rid of the requirement for commercial first floor broadly applied to zoning districts. And we actually have that. I was just thinking one of our commercial districts requires first floor commercial. And so it's everywhere in that district. You have to do that. We're not very selective. Are there any other code provisions or common elements that you see in cities, kind of going back to that flaw question, but more specific zoning regulations that you've seen that you wish communities would just remove tomorrow?
I'm tempted to say parking requirement because that's the sexy answer today. And to my somewhat surprise, more and more cities are doing it. It's a little known fact that in downtown areas, half of American big cities have had parking minimums and half have not for years, decades. Some never had them. I can't tell the difference because in a dense downtown area, the market will handle this. If you don't have enough parking, they won't sign the lease. And if you don't have to have it in your building, they can be next door. You can sign a lease with the parking garage. it'll figure itself out in the downtown areas. It's when you get into smaller areas and neighborhoods that it gets political. However, this is another area where I am surprised that more and more cities are doing it. My home city of Denver just did it. First of all, they get rid of commercial ones because that doesn't really scare people. They're persuaded that probably the market can figure this out. And then they get rid of residential, much harder sell to do. And yet the early reactions are, the market seems to be handling. Remember, not requiring it doesn't mean the developer won't put it in. They put in what they need. I will say this, after 40 years, 35 years of writing development codes, the parking standards in our zoning codes are all over the map. It's as if somebody threw darts at a dartboard. This is not rocket science. There are books out there that say you need this much for that use. I have never had a client say, write that into my code. They have asked me, say, compare us to other cities that you think are comparable in economics and demographics and activity levels. Give us the lowest number you can that you think will work. And that's what I've done for years. But the bottom line is, in the course of doing that, you look at the codes around the country and say, somebody was smoking something, because this makes no sense. This is a technical exercise. These things should cohere over time. And it's cohered enough for somebody to write a book about it. There are national parking standards, but I have never been asked to write them into a code. I'm sorry to go off and long-winded. My number one candidate would be discretionary reviews based on vague criteria. Sending people into a popularity contest based on words like compatibility, harmonious, distinctive, high quality. They're just asking for an argument. And some neighborhoods have the time and money and ability and understanding of local government to engage in that argument very much and effectively, to say, no, it's not compatible. You say it's compatible, I say it's not compatible. And others have much less ability to do that. That's why, even though it's part of the unsexy procedural part of zoning, Oregon has been trying to do this for a long time. So have some of the New England states. It turns out it's very hard to define what is a clear and objective standard. And yet we can get a lot closer to it than we have today. If you say compatible, what is compatibility? Height? Say that. Roof shape? Say that. Massing of the building? Say that. Location on the lot? Say that. Materials? Say that. What is it that you could write down? Well, I'll know it when I see it, is not a good principle for governance. And it just leads to an unfair, not only a time-consuming debate, but one in which we tend to perpetuate the inequalities in our society. So that's my number one thing. Just get those words out of your code. Do the hard thinking now rather than saying, well, we'll debate it every time it comes up.
I feel like you just took like a machine gun to our design committee standards.
There's at least one state, I'm trying to think of which one it was. It might have been Montana. I can't remember which one. Recently passed a state law that said you will not turn down housing based on design standards. You can do other things, inadequate traffic, inadequate water, inadequate sewer, inability to serve, but you can't say design standards because you're using that to kill valid projects. Similarly, the state of Connecticut has said you can't turn things down based solely on a statement that they don't match the neighborhood character. You can say that, but you better have another more objective reason, because that's what you're doing. Every single one is a good use of land and a source of housing, and somehow they all failed to meet neighborhood character. So we're just going to say, we're not going to let you do that anymore.
One of the things that I really appreciated is that over and over again, you've talked about how you speak with developers, get their perspective. I think that there's kind of a cross talk between the planning profession and the developers that actually have to do the work of building cities. So in all of the interviews that you've taken on and all the feedback that you've received from developers, what do you think is the one takeaway that planners should think about when considering redevelopment opportunities from the development perspective?
Well, from the redevelopment perspective, which again was one of the intended focuses of my book and a good chunk of this interview, allow for the unexpected and allow for the administrative flexibility for staff to do their job, to do the best they can to work around the site constraints and have the site get put into use for a development that is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Do it administratively, but, and I use this example in the book, the smaller the site, the harder it is to redevelop. So if you, for example, frequently I write codes that say, things happen. Not every piece of land is a square that's flat and well drained and served. So staff has the ability to vary the following list of 7 or 10 or 5 or 2 standards: parking, height, setbacks, open space, lot coverage, by 10% for the following reasons. If they find that the utilities are in the way, you can't get a tree there, the arborist says the tree won't grow there. You have to give a reason that is unique to that site, but we don't want to make the guy go get a variance. That takes another process, and they'll get the variance. They'll just have to file another application fee, go out through another public. It's a reasonable thing to do. Allow staff to approve it if the cause is this. So a 10% variation in a list of things for specific reasons is a very common provision in newer codes. Albuquerque went further and said, if it's a small lot, you're going to need 15% or 20%. A small zoned district with small lots and small zoning setbacks, 10% turns out to be 6 inches. That didn't do anything. So they actually did the extra thinking to think, we want our staff to have administrative flexibility to make reasonable decisions without going through another hearing, either a zoning or a variance hearing, just to make that decision. That is the decision. We approve you notwithstanding a slightly shorter setback. But we're not only going to build that into our code, we're going to build in more flexibility for the smaller lots and the places that are particularly hard to redevelop and put into use.
Yeah, those smaller lots really stand out. We have a ton here in Lincoln that either never developed or there was a house, it got torn down, it's vacant, but clearly all the other lots that are less than the required width have houses on it. The houses are fine. There's not a detriment to public health, safety, or welfare. But the code is it blankets everything. So a standard lot versus an infill lot here, we could have another house on that lot if it was more flexible, like the 10% waivers in either direction or 15%.
Well, and some codes have written provisions saying if the problem is that your lot is too small by 10%, the side setbacks and the rear setback go down by 10%. Your lot's too narrow by 10%, blah, blah, blah. So you can actually build it in there in numbers, or you can just say, staff, we hire planners to do their job. We, city council, hereby approve a code that say, this is your job. Don't say no unnecessarily, and don't engage in an individual neighbor to neighbor battle over a foot. It's just a really poor use of taxpayer dollars. And so we need a house. 5 years from now, no one will know that 1 foot was gone. No one will know. It makes no difference to the future of the city.
I say that with almost every complaint. Like, some of your favorite places in cities you would have complained about when they were originally being developed.
Yeah.
So knock it off.
Well, one of these, and you haven't asked this question, but one of the points that's become, I don't know why it took me so long to be able to articulate it, but I have in the book a little bit, and that is that our systems are kind of set up for people to object to change in general and find a reason to object it. I understand it's human nature to be afraid of change, but it's also part of good governance to educate people about the fact that change happens, and we're trying to write rules that allow it to happen reasonably. And no, you will not be involved in everything that happens. That's not how cities work. But the other thing is that people adapt. The thing that was terribly objectionable when it was approved, if you go back into the neighborhood, some people have moved in, some people have moved out, some people live there. I almost guarantee you walk door to door and take a survey. Some of the people who said, I fought it, but it's okay. It's fine. It's surprising how often that happens with group homes. I hate it. You're killing my property values. And without saying those people, I really don't want those people on my block. You go back and say, how are they doing? Say, actually, it's the best kept property on the block. We got no problems at all. I'm a little ashamed that I objected to this. The planners and the operator told me they would do a good job, and they've done a good job. I was afraid of change, or I was motivated by my neighbors. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm trying to say governance involves educating people about the need for change, and people do adapt, and they change their minds about the acceptability of change after it's happened much more than they do when they can't envision or haven't experienced it.
First of all, thank you for allowing Stephanie and I this cathartic conversation to complain about all the things we hate about zoning. But this is Booked on Planning, so what books would you recommend readers check out?
Well, the book has a full list at the end of the books that I like about zoning and planning, but primarily about zoning. I'm going to put it in 2 categories. Old books. Everybody should read Death and Life of Great American Cities. That is fascinating, and it's talked about over planning and empowering planners too much to tell you what's good and bad for you. But we've been through a reaction where we've gone the other way and kind of said, well, no, whatever the planners say is just advice, and what the neighborhoods say is what's good planning. But that book started the debate. So that one, and Image of the City by Kevin Lynch. I realize it's a very old book, but it's about how people perceive the cities, what they notice, what they don't notice, and how they form their opinion of whether it's a good place or a bad place or an interesting place. And I really think planners should focus more on those things, because that is how things are perceived. And that's the places that are in that book are worth extra attention. I call them in my book, capital P places. They're worth additional thinking and regulation, as opposed to small p places, which doesn't mean they're unimportant, but means you can take a lighter hand. And that is most cities. In new books, The Color of Law should be must reading for everybody who goes to kindergarten. No, that's not true. Everybody who graduates from college for certain. I do recommend you read Nolan Gray's book, Arbitrary Lines. It's a good book. It makes a compelling argument. I don't agree with his conclusion, but that doesn't mean it's not a very good book. Sarah Bronin's Key to the City. I found Richard Florida's The New Urban Crisis an interesting book to read. It's disturbing, but his thinking has evolved from his original book. And so it's interesting to see that evolve. And then Katz, probably Wilkerson's book on the stratification. The older I get, the more I'm aware of the intersection between planning, zoning, and segregation and exclusion in America. So some of these are about zoning and some are just about the system we have set up that we shouldn't be very proud of and that zoning and planning can affect.
All great books to add to our list. We've had a good number of these authors on the show before, and then I will be very sad if the image of the city is no longer taught. It was key to one of the early classes in the planning program here at University of Nebraska. So if that's too old now and they're not teaching it, that'll be kind of a sad day. Thank you so much for being on the show and talk about your book, An Even Better Way to Zone, Achieving More Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Communities.
Thank you for inviting me.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with author Donald Elliott on his book, An Even Better Way to Zone, Achieving More Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Communities. You can get your own copy through the publisher at Island Press, now an imprint of the Princeton University Press, by supporting your local bookstore, or to support the show through our page at bookshop.org/shop/bookdownplanning. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.